This video tutorial is going to look at user-defined Python functions. It is a follow-on tutorial from the last video in the playlist that looked at why we have functions in Python. In this video we are going to create and test a user-defined function that has input parameters and a return value. In the previous video we looked at this particular structure chart and we can see that we have various modules calling each other, and between the modules we can see we have data couples, and we said that in the next video we were actually going to implement one of these modules as a Python function. And in fact the module we were going to implement is this one here, calculate gross pay. If we consider this particular module in isolation, i.e. the calculate gross pay module, which we're going to actually implement as a function, we know to this particular module we're sending the pay rate and we're sending the hours worked. And of course the module will look at the pay rate and the hours worked, will perform a calculation which is to calculate the gross pay, which involves multiplying the pay rate by the hours worked, and of course the gross pay will be generated and this will actually be returned. And the advantage of having the structure chart is we can pull out the individual modules and write code for those and test them. So this can now be coded and tested independently. Before we go on and look at how we do that, I think we need to revisit the idea of a module specification, which is shown here. And we can see that this module, when it becomes a function in Python, is going to have a function name, which is going to be calculate gross pay. It's going to have input parameters which we can see are going to be pay rate and hours worked, and it's going to have a return value which is going to be gross pay. Now of course it's also going to have mechanics. Another word for mechanics in this context would be the algorithm for the particular section of code that will have to appear inside this particular function. And the mechanics in this particular case are pretty straightforward. It's simply gross pay is assigned pay rate times hours worked. And of course, if we're going to store the result of this multiplication in gross pay, we need a variable to do that, and that variable is going to appear inside the function as a local variable. And you can see I'm showing that appearing here. So our responsibility now as a programmer is to actually write a testing program in Python that's actually going to call the calculate gross pay module, which will be a Python function, and we'll be sending the pay rate and we'll be sending the hours worked. So the testing program will have to get hold of the pay rate and the hours worked, and I'm going to do that by allowing the user to enter something at the keyboard, where the user this time is going to be a programmer testing this particular calculate gross pay function. And what calculate gross pay is going to do, it's going to calculate the gross pay and it's going to return that to the testing program. And as a programmer we have a look at that by displaying it on the screen to see if in fact it is what we expect it to be for the pay rate and hours worked. And don't forget, if you're going to write a computer program, you must yourself know how to calculate gross pay. Seems an obvious thing to say, but it is important that you develop a test plan to prove the calculate gross pay function, as it will be in Python, behaves correctly. Therefore, as a programmer, what we have this relationship between a testing program and the calculate gross pay module, and we also have the module specification, as you can see here. We then use this information to produce the calculate gross pay function, which can be seen here. If we now have a look at the structure of the Python function, we can see that this is the header, this is the mechanics, this is the algorithm, and in this case the algorithm is pretty straightforward, it's just one program statement, and this represents the return value. This is what we're going to be returning. And we can see here that we have indentation, and that's because we know these two lines belong to the calculate gross pay function. If we refer to this part of the function where it says DEF, that's an abbreviation for definition, and that's how we say that we're just about to define a function in Python. And if we come over here, we can see we have the colon. Now that's typical of Python. If you look at this, you can see that that is the name of the function. And if you come to the brackets, these are the parameters that this particular function is going to be dealing with. And these parameters have a specific name. They're referred to as formal parameters. This particular line here, well, that's the actual mechanics of this particular function. And we can see that we are taking the pay rate, which was one of the input parameters, the hours worked, which was one of the other input parameters, and we're multiplying them together, and that's going to give us the actual gross pay, which is assigned to this particular variable here, where this variable is in fact the local variable, as defined here in the module specification. And of course, when we come to this particular line, what that is going to do, it's going to return the gross pay that was calculated on this line. And of course, this particular line was defined in the module specification here. And we can see when we go to this diagram that the gross pay is being returned in the structure chart as a data couple. But we can see that in Python, when we wish to return something as represented by this particular structure chart, we use this word here, return. Now if we consider a testing program, where this testing program is going to actually test the function calculate gross pay, then what we're going to have to do is to get our testing program to send the employee pay rate and the employee hours to the calculate gross pay function. And just note that I've given these different names here. It'll become obvious why I've done that in a moment. And of course, the calculate gross pay is going to calculate the gross pay and return that to the testing program. Now, there's something important that we have to appreciate here. These two input data couples and this output data couple, when we are dealing with these, when we go to the code, these two are going to be the input parameters to this function, and this one is going to be the return value from this particular function. Now, the testing program, if it's capable of sending these two and receiving this, then it must have three variables that A, can grab hold of some data so it can pass these two to calculate gross pay. And when calculate gross pay returns this, there must be a variable in the testing program capable of storing this value. And that's what I'm showing here. We can see we have the testing program having three variables within the testing program. The testing program is appearing on the screen now, and if we have a look, we can see there are four program statements. The first two statements, well, they're going to allow the programmer who's going to be testing this particular calculate gross pay function the ability to enter appropriate numbers to see if the calculate gross pay is actually going to function properly. The third line of the code, well, that's the actual call to the calculate gross pay function. And I can tell it's the call because if you have a look at the name of the function, we can see it's calculate gross pay, and that appears here in the actual code. So I know that's a call from the testing program to this particular function, i.e. we're representing this line here, this calling line. Now the fourth line of the testing program, well, that's simply going to be displaying with an appropriate user-friendly string and an appropriate formatting of the actual employee gross pay value to the screen. So as a programmer, we can have a look at it and see whether in fact it gives us the output we were expecting from the inputs as programmers we put in to the testing program and passed to the calculate gross pay function. Let's single step through this particular program to illustrate its execution. If we go to the first line, we can see here that we're using an input function, and that's putting this user-friendly string, please enter the employee pay rate, on the screen so we know what we're supposed to be entering. And I'm going to enter £9.50 for this, and this is going to convert what I enter to a float and assign it to employee pay rate. And of course, the 9.5 will be stored in the employee pay rate. If we go on to the next line, it's pretty similar. We've got this input function here. This user-friendly message goes to the screen. We then enter the appropriate number of hours, and I'm going to enter 35 hours here. That gets converted to a float, which then gets assigned to employee hours, and we can see the employee hours gets the 35 that I entered as the testing programmer. We now go on to the third line of the testing program, and we can see here we have an assignment statement, and to the right of the assignment statement you can see we have this. Now this is the call to the calculate gross pay function, and I know that because of this name here. But what we can see in the brackets, we have employee pay rate and employee hours. Now the employee pay rate we can see has actually got the value of 9.5. Now what's going to happen here is that 9.5 appears here as this data couple. If we now go to employee hours, we can see that that's got the value of 35, and that's going to appear here as part of the employee hours. So the 9.5 and the 35 are the data couples that are sent to this particular function here. Now here we can see the code for the function, and what we now need to do is to realize that this particular function is now going to execute, and this 9.5 here, which was passed from employee pay rate, which was the value stored here in the testing program, will appear here, and that will be passed to the pay rate. This 35, which was this value which is stored in the employee hours, is going to be passed to this hours worked, so this is going to get 35. So we can see there's a relationship here, and the relationship is as follows. Whatever is in here will appear here. Whatever's in this variable will appear here. Now these two are examples of formal parameters, and the key here is we have to refer to them as formal parameters. The ones we passed, which are these two, they are actual parameters and sometimes referred to as arguments. But what we can now see is that pay rate stores 9.5, hours worked stores 35. So when we get onto this line, we multiply the 9.5 by the hours worked, and that's going to give us 332.5, which will be assigned to gross pay. And that value you can see I have appearing here. When we go onto this line, you can see it's going to return the gross pay. So if we now reflect on the structure chart, what it means is that gross pay is going to get this value here, 332.5. And that's going to be returned, i.e. passed back, and it's going to be stored somewhere, and we're going to see that it gets stored here in employee gross pay. Now why there? Well, let's go back to the third line, and we can see we have this assignment statement here, meaning that whatever this returns is going to be assigned to employee gross pay, and we can see that it's returned 332.5, so that gets stored in employee gross pay, as you can see by this diagram representation of the execution of the program. Then we go on to execute the fourth line of the program, and we can see that this is a print function which will print this user-friendly message here together with the employee gross pay, which will be appropriately formatted to 2 decimal places. This is the program as it appears in the file. Here we can see we have the actual definition of the calculate gross pay function, and here we see we have the testing program. You will often heard it said that Python has what is referred to as runtime compilation. Now this process starts at the top of the file and moves to the bottom of the file in the following way. Now the runtime starts at the top of the file, and what it will do, it'll take this definition here and it'll convert it into a format that is executable. In other words, we're looking at what is essentially the English language, albeit a little cryptic in its nature, and it'll get converted into the language of the machine, something the machine understands, so it can execute it. The key here, however, is for us to realize that it doesn't get executed now. What will happen, this, when it's converted to an executable format, gets executed when it's called. And we can see, if we look at the testing program, it's called on this line here. So the process is as follows. Take this, convert it to an executable format, then go to this line, convert that to an executable format and execute it, then go to this line, convert this to an executable format and execute it, then go to this line, and what this line will do, it'll result, because of this name here, in executing what this is in its executable format. Once this has finished executing, we then go back to this line here. So we can see that there appears to be a little bit of jumping around here. In other words, we start by executing this line, then this line, then this, which causes to go and execute this, and when we finish executing this, we go and finish the testing program by executing this last line here. Let's consider the runtime for this particular program, and we can see it starts off with this. Please enter the employee pay rate. And that's there because of this input function actually putting out this user-friendly message here. Now, as a user of this program, I need to enter something here. And I'm going to be consistent with what I said earlier in the video, and I'm going to enter £9.50 here. And you can see that is entered at this position, 9.50. Now, this is going to be stored in employee pay rate. The next line is executed, and this input function here actually puts out this user-friendly message on the visual display unit, as we can see here. Now, what I need to do as the user is to actually enter the hours worked by the employee. So I'm going to enter 35, as you can see here. Now, this 35 is then stored here in employee hours. The next line is executed, and this is a call to this particular function here. And we know it's a call to this function because we can see the function has this name, and that name is reflected here. What we have in the brackets here are the actual parameters, often called arguments, and there's a relationship between these and these formal parameters here. The employee pay rate, which we know is 9.5, is actually given to this pay rate parameter here, this formal parameter pay rate. This employee hours, which is storing 35, is actually given to hours worked here. Now, when we now multiply the pay rate by the hours worked, we're going to get 332.5, and that is assigned to gross pay. And of course, this line now returns that gross pay, which is 332.5, and that is assigned to employee gross pay. Now, this line is executed, and it gives the output as we can see here. And we're outputting this user-friendly string here. And here we can see we're formatting employee gross pay, and this is telling us it's going to be to 2 decimal places. And we can see here we have 332.50, and the 50 we can see are the 2 decimal places. If we briefly return to the structure chart, what we've just done, we've actually implemented the calculate gross pay module, and we now know that it's functioning in the way it should do. I need to test it a little bit more than I have done, but we now can see that this bit of the overall structure chart is actually done. And we can now go on to actually implement some of the other modules as shown in this particular structure chart using a Python function. I think I would like to stress also at this particular point, the testing program is really no use for the final product. It was just part of the process. So that bit of the program ultimately is thrown away. The bit we want, the bit we keep, is the actual function, the calculate gross pay. Check out the supporting website for these videos, and also consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and get an automatic update every time I upload a new video. Also consider subscribing to the Google Plus circle that relates to these videos.